Hi there, welcome to my channel. My name is Clymer and I'm a children's book author and illustrator. Today I'm going to show you the illustration process for my award-winning book, Myla's Magic Day. I've also written and illustrated The Great Garden Escape, which you see here, and Please Don't Tell My Human. But I chose Myla's Magic Day because I wanted to show how I illustrate both human and animal characters, and because the story is really near and dear to my heart. Myla's Magic Day is about a girl who just moved to a new neighborhood and is hesitant to make friends. That is until her sketch of a zebra named Magic comes to life. Magic helps her to believe in herself, overcome fear, and know that she doesn't have to change to make friends. Before I get started, I wanted to show some of the final illustrations just as context for the rest of the video. So let's take a look. Okay, so now that you have a bit of background, let's get started. The very first thing I like to do after the story is written is print out a black and white text-only version of the book. This will have the text that's on each page, but not necessarily in its final placement. I'll then go through and do some rough sketches and write out some ideas for each illustration. I'll also think about whether the illustration should be a spread, which means it spans across 2 pages, a single full-page illustration, or if there'll be one or more smaller drawings on the page. Everything at this stage is really rough, but it helps me think about how long the illustrations will take. And so the next thing I like to do is create a timeline. Here's the timeline I created for Myla's Magic Day, and you'll notice that I don't go in sequential order. And that's because I like to do 1 or 2 larger illustrations that'll help determine some of the other illustrations in the book. So it just makes things a little easier. At this stage, I'm also doing other things, so I factor that into my timeline as well. And you'll see Myla's Magic Day took me about 3 to 4 months to do all of the illustrations. So now that I have some rough sketches and a timeline, the very first thing I like to illustrate are the main characters. Since they are the most important part of the story, I like to take time to develop them up front. For Myla's Magic Day, the 2 main characters are Myla, a 7-year-old girl who loves to draw, and Magic, a sweet and fun-loving zebra. Before I get started, I like to write down some attributes of each character just to make sure that the way they look conveys their personality and goes along with the story. Here is a list of the characteristics for Myla. For human characters, I typically like to focus on the face first, so I created a bunch of concept sketches. Of all the drawings, I felt these 2 fit her best, so I added color and more detail. I do this using a program called Adobe Fresco on my iPad Pro, along with an Apple Pencil. I will show a short demo of this process a little later in the video. With these 2 drawings, I like the liveliness of the facial features on the left, but the hairstyle on the right. So I decided to combine these to come up with the final version of Myla's face. The next thing I like to do is flesh out facial expressions so that I can make sure her features work with different emotions. I will go through the story and write down how she is feeling at certain points to make sure those are captured up front. I also then like to draw different views of her face: front, side, 3/4, and back. Once I have the face and head illustrations, I will sketch out a front view of the body and then add color and detail. At this stage, I only flesh out the front view because the other views will depend on what activity she is doing, plus the angles and perspectives of the scene in each page illustration. So I will wait till I get to the page illustrations to do those different views and perspectives of her figure. Now I'm going to show a demo of how I work in Adobe Fresco. I do want to mention that you certainly do not have to work digitally to illustrate a children's book. You can use paper or canvas along with colored pencils, paints, pastels, do cutouts, whatever you're comfortable with. The main difference is that when you don't work digitally, your paper or canvas will have to be scanned and then formatted for a print file for the book. So now let's take a look at the demo. So for the demo, I'm going to use this sketch of Myla that I did on pencil and paper. And whenever I do a sketch on pencil and paper that I want to bring into the app, I'll just take a photo of it with the iPad and then I'll show you how you can easily add it in. All right, so I've already launched Adobe Fresco. I'm gonna do a new document, so I'm gonna choose custom size. And when I'm doing characters, I like to draw them bigger to start than they're gonna be in the book, just for resolution purposes. So if I draw them small and I have to scale them up, they're gonna lose some quality. So I always like to draw them bigger and then they could be scaled down and not lose that quality. So I'm gonna change my unit to inches. I'm gonna do width of 20, height of 20, and this is just random. It's just making sure it's bigger than they are in the book. And then I always design at 300 PPI for print. This is super important, and I'll touch on that a little bit later in the video. So I'll choose Create Document, and then I want to bring in that photo that I took of Myla. So here's the sketch. Like I said, I just took a photo of it. I'm gonna make the sketch a lot bigger here. And then now it's brought into my document. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the opacity down so that I can draw over this sketch while I'm adding my colors. What I'm doing here is going over each feature of the sketch with a flat color. I'll then add texture, shadows, and highlights using different brushes along with tones and shades of the flat colors. Adobe Fresco has many different brush options to explore. Brushes are meant to simulate real drawing utensils such as paint, crayon, pastels, charcoal, etc. For the illustration style I used for Myla's Magic Day, I used about 4 or 5 different brushes. I use a similar process for coloring all the characters and objects throughout the book, always starting with a flat color and then adding texture, shadows, and highlights. Now let's take a look at magic. So again, I started with writing down a few of Magic's attributes and then doing some exploratory sketches. I felt this one best fit the style I'd established with Myla as well as Magic's personality. I took the sketch of Magic into Adobe Fresco and added Myla's image to the document just so that I could see the two characters side by side and make sure I was maintaining consistency between them. I was almost finished adding color and detail to Magic when I felt the face wasn't quite what I was going for. I then went back and resketched it as you will see here. This became the final image. As I am coloring and adding the details, I do sometimes change things from the initial sketch. You may have noticed that in the final image, Magic's ears are much larger and a different shape than the sketch. I find that as I'm adding more color and detail, I can sometimes see improvements more clearly. So now that I have my main characters fleshed out, I'll dive into page illustrations. For page illustrations, I'll go right to sketching in Adobe Fresco versus pencil and paper because I find that I'm typically not exploring a bunch of different concepts for page illustrations, but more on refining one concept. And I just find this a little bit more streamlined to do digitally. But before I get into sketching, I want to talk a little bit about how I set up my page documents. So Myla's Magic Day is an 8.5 by 11 book, so each page will be 8.5 by 11, but I have to account for page bleed. If you're not familiar with bleed, it's just typically an extra 1/8 of an inch or so that gets added around the page so that when the printer cuts it, you don't see any white edges. You'll want to check with your publisher or printer on exact requirements for bleed and your book size, but here's what I use for Myla's Magic Day as an example. So for a spread, the width would measure 17.25 and the height would be 11.25. For an individual page, the width would be 8.625 and the height would be 11.25. Now both left and right have the same measurements, but in my case, the bleed was different. So the bleed on the left page would be on the left edge and the bleed for the right page would be on the right edge. So to create a new page illustration document in Adobe Fresco, I already launched the app. I'm going to choose custom size, and I'm going to work on a spread. So I'm going to change the unit from pixels to inches. My spread size is 17.25 for the width and 11.25 for the height. I'm going to change the pixel size to 300 dpi, which is super important. Print documents always have to be printed at 300 dpi, and that's so they have crisp images. You don't want to go lower than that, and a lot of printers won't even accept files that are lower than 300 dpi. So make sure you're designing at that. One time I forgot to change it, and I had to redo my whole drawing because it was at 72. And if you try to scale that up, it just loses quality. So definitely always make sure you're doing 300 ppi. And then I'll hit create document. And now I'm ready to start sketching. So just like the characters, I like to start out by writing down attributes of the story setting to help guide my illustrations. Here are a few points I captured for the setting, which mostly takes place in Myla's bedroom. I also like to create a main color palette up front that reflects the character and setting attributes. I started with this one you'll see here. As I mentioned earlier, I like to begin with a major illustration that will help guide some of the others, so I chose one that shows a very large view of her room. I then worked on a few different color options for the walls and carpet. After getting some feedback on these, this option was chosen. I then filled in the rest of the details and saw that Myla was blending in too much with the background. I decided to add yellow to the main color palette and apply this to her shirt as well as the stars and some other details. I really liked how the yellow made Myla stand out and added more life to the new color palette. As a side note, this is just the main color palette, and as you have seen, I did use other colors for different details throughout the book. From here, I continue working on each page, always starting with a sketch and then adding color and detail. Here are a few sketch to final page examples. Once the page illustrations are complete, they'll go into a program called Adobe InDesign where the text is added and the file is saved for print. My next step would then be to work on the cover. I like to do this last even though I have a good idea in the beginning of what I think the cover should be. My preference is to do it last because I feel like with the page illustrations, I've got to do a lot of refining and improvements on my illustrations, and it just makes the cover that much easier and better. Similar to page illustrations, your cover file will have a very specific size. Again, this will come from your publisher or printer and be dependent on your book size, the number of pages, and whether you're designing for hardcover or paperback, because each of those have different files. This image here shows my hardcover template for Myla's Magic Day. It includes the front, spine, and back cover. The total dimensions ended up being about 18 inches in width by 11.75 in height. On hardcovers, there's extra bleed to account for the paper that gets folded and glued to the cover. You want to make sure you're keeping all the text and any important imagery at least a ½ inch from the edge of the book, which is what the pink area shows. For the cover, I like to start by only focusing on the front and then add the back and spine once the front is complete. Here's my first pass at the front cover. I knew early on in the illustration process that I wanted to show magic rising out of the sketchbook. I purposely reserved this magical moment for the cover with the interior illustration showing what happens right before and right after this moment. When I finished this version, I felt showing anything below the desk was unnecessary and made it too busy. So I then created this next version here on the right. At this point, I also got feedback that maybe white wasn't the best color choice for the background, so I mocked up a few other options, as you see here. We were leaning towards the blue, but I didn't love it. I actually gave it a rest for a couple days so I could come back with fresh eyes. During that rest time, it popped into my head to try and use all the colors, so I created this version and it became the final one. I find that if I feel something isn't right and just not working, it's best to take a little break and come back with fresh eyes. This always seems to help me when I'm stuck. Okay, so now that I have the front cover design, I carried the color and stars through to the back and added one of my favorite illustrations from the interior of Myla and Magic Dancing. And here is the final cover file. And that is my process for illustrating a children's book. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to see more of. Also, I recently released my first How to Draw book, Animals from A to Z in 6 Simple Steps. It's great for kids or beginners, anyone new to drawing. I'll link that below along with any other relevant links. If you enjoyed watching the video, I would love it if you gave it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching.